Good afternoon, and my name is Stacia Stilk, and welcome to Pathway to a Joyous Landscape, Plant Native Plants with Alan Branhagen. Don't forget to use the chat feature on the right side of your screen if you have questions or comments as we go along, so please feel free to add them there. If we have time at the end of this session, we'll take a few minutes to answer some of those questions. Otherwise, Alan is hosting a half-hour office hours immediately following this presentation that we can talk with him directly. Now I'd like to welcome Alan Branhagen. Since 2017, Alan Branhagen has been the Director of Operations at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. Prior to this, he was the Director of Horticulture at Powell Gardens, Kansas City's botanical gardens, for more than 20 years. And early in his career, he was at the Winnebago County Forest Preserve District in Rockford, Illinois. A knowledgeable and talented writer, you may have one of Alan's books on your bookshelf: The Gardener's Butterfly Book, Native Plants of the Midwest, and the Midwest Native Plant Primer, 225 plants for an earth-friendly garden. Alan received his Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from Iowa State University and a Master of Landscape Architecture from Louisiana State University, with emphasis on design with nature. Beyond public garden management, he is an all-around plantsman and naturalist, specializing in birds, butterflies, and botany. He is in the process of creating a new natural garden on 2.4 acres overlooking the Minnesota River Valley in Chaska, Minnesota. Welcome, Alan, and take it away.
Thank you, Stacia. And I'm thankful that Planet Native invited me to speak, and always great to be back, even virtually, in Kansas City, where I spent over 20 years, as Stacia said. So yes, my program today is called Pathways to a Joyous Landscape. And I have to ask the question, what kind of landscape do you want to come home to after work? Do you want to come back to a boring green lawn with little shrubberies all trimmed into squares? Or do you want to come back to a place like Stacia said? I'm developing a 2.5-acre lot in Chaska, Minnesota, overlooking the Minnesota River Valley. And, that's what this program is going to be about. When I come home, pulling up the driveway, it's right this time of year, it's like, how many monarchs can I see? How many young goldfinches are feeding on the seed heads of plants? But we're going to, for this program, we're actually going to look at how my personal landscape has progressed from 2017, when I bought it as a traditional landscape, until looking at it today. So, and of course, Pathways to a Joyous Landscape, we all know about native plants and how critical they are to engaging nature and part of the web of life. I'm going to go to the next slide. And of course, now I'm starting off with a glitch. We just did this and it worked, and now it's not working. Amy, can you push me to the next slide? There, I guess I have control on it. So apologize for that. So, this is one of my front yard plantings early on, but I hope you find this in vibrant and exciting, and expressing our spirit of place here in the Midwest, as my south-facing front yard does, was probably an old hill prairie. And so utilizing native prairie plants in that spot, they are right at home, and you can see the exuberance in this planting. When I lived in Missouri, this is my home, Luna Ridge, outside Kansas City, actually very close to Powell Gardens. And of course, there as well, I had 6 acres of land, and practiced what I preach there. As you can see, have very, very, very little lawn, lots and lots and lots of native plants. My house was ensconced in nature, and boy, that did bring a lot of joy. Had over 180 species of birds at this property, and 74 species of butterflies, which is, to me, is a successful landscape. So I think the things to focus on with a joyous landscape, of course, is that it is sustainable. You are playing off the original soil and natural resources of that site, and not adding lots of inputs. And the critical component is ecosystem services. And I always get a question after a program, can you explain ecosystem services a little bit better? Well, it's everything from the air we breathe, obviously plants and photosynthesis, the byproduct of that is the oxygen in the air we breathe. It's about the water cycle and all the native plants capturing the rainfall and not having as much runoff, and letting that water percolate into the the groundwater, the water table, and how critical that is to our overall existence. And of course, if you think you can live without wild things, you should know that you cannot. That whole web of life, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, is one of the ecosystem services. When you think about, right now it's apple season up here in Minnesota. Where did that apple come from? If you didn't have pollinators, you wouldn't have that apple. And then of course, just that joy aspect. Don't underestimate that. We forget that these landscapes must be, when they're filled with life and beauty of all these diverse native plants and flowers and insects and birds and animals, that really brings great joy. And here's a picture of what I consider, the epitome of a sustainable landscape, in one taken just to the southwest of Kansas City at the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve outside Strong City, Kansas. And I also love this picture because a lot of the Kansas City region did look like this prior to settlement, with a lot of the big ridges all covered with prairie. And just think about all the carbon sequestration of that, how all that prairie grass captures excessive rainfall and helps it with their deep roots, helps get that water into the water table. And of course, along the creeks and ravines and more sheltered areas, there was timber and forested areas. And if you've never been to the Tallgrass Prairie National Reserve, please go, because it is such an inspiration of what not only the Kansas City region, but even most of the Midwest, as this wonderful blend between the tallgrass prairie and the central hardwood forest, what it did look like prior to settlement. And here's more on ecosystem services and that quote. The first time I heard Doug tell me, he said that at the beginning of his program, and I it always resonates with me. And we really need to have all this nature around us so that we have clean air and we have clean water and we have healthy food and healthy soils. And connecting children to the nature, as you can see in these pictures, and how important that is, so that they start to understand that concept, and really is vital to our long-term existence. So yeah, the blue-winged teal there in the upper left in the wetland, for water, the Cecropia caterpillars. It's actually from the Festival of Butterflies out at Powell Gardens. And being part of that important web of life, and how insects really do fuel the system after plants and their photosynthesis, and are the beginning of the web of life for things like the chickadee in that picture, which of course needs caterpillars and other invertebrates like spiders to feed its young, so that it can have another batch of, and only one brood a year, of chickadees for the next year. Things like dragonflies and of course a songbird nest there. And I'll just look at this picture. These are meadow blazing stars, Liatris ligula stylus. For down in your region, it's Liatris scariosa, is very similar, though this plant will do well down for you as well. But when I come home down the driveway and pass by, in late August, when the monarchs are migrating into early September now, seeing this, I hope that this brings you great joy. And this is what I am talking about, that these kind of experiences finding their traditional landscapes are seeing. And of course, in terms of any landscape, I am a landscape architect, and I always have to hit home, the three guiding principles when you are designing and selecting plants is, plants, no matter what it is, they have horticultural requirements, where they grow, and you have to have the conditions, where they grow. If you have a wooded, shady site, a prairie plant is not going to be so happy, something that needs really full sun. Or if you have a dry wetland or dry rocky knob and you want to plant a wetland plant there, of course, it's not going to do well. We tend to think of hardiness zones on that, though pretty much most Midwestern plants are hardy throughout the entire Midwest. But I think we understand, planting a palm tree in Kansas City or Minneapolis is just not going to work. And of course, you want them to function in your landscape. You want them to provide shade or bring in nature or screen a bad view or cover the ground. Think about what their function is in your landscape. And these guiding principles first, and then finally look at the aesthetics of that plant and its beauty in terms of most of us think of color and the blooming of flowers, but forms in the winter, the branching patterns of plants and what dried grasses look like. Don't forget all the other senses as well. The wind blowing through grasses or conifer trees, is sound and fragrance. All those aspects are really critical aesthetic things for a plant. And of course, Stacia mentioned my most recent book, The Midwest Native Plant Primer. And on the right is my front yard landscape. And I feel, again, I do walk this talk and, utilizing all these native plants and starting to create that habitat and joyous landscape right there. The insect you see is the federally endangered rusty-patched bumblebee, which I do have a very healthy population of those in my yard. They have been absolutely consistent starting the third year of planting all this. And last year I had many queens. The queens are out right now, and I've seen one, but I've just been really busy not to really watch, but I've still seen the worker bees, which they have that, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but this little rusty patch lined with yellow. They are not found in the Kansas City region. They are more eastern and northern to Kansas City. But again, a federally endangered insect, which is in trouble. And I show this that also that all of you creating these kinds of landscapes can start making a difference for these creatures. And first and foremost, what I like to talk about is reducing your lawn. And this is standing on the front step of Luna Ridge, where I lived in Kansas City. And when I first bought this property, this view looking up to the road, the entire thing was turf. Under all those trees, it was 100% turf. And of course, one of the first things I did was start to create future beds connecting the different trees that I wouldn't have to mow around, and really reducing the lawn. And this space here, there's actually, you don't really see it, but there is a really nice turf space wrapping around the house. And to me, that makes a lot of sense for use for maintenance of the house itself. I even thought of things like fire break. In this rural area, you could have a wildfire, and of course, turf is a great fire break. This front upper part is just a wonderful oval lawn that actually, when I wrote Native Plants of the Midwest, sitting in that little circular area is where I wrote a lot of that book. And it was great being ensconced in nature and seeing the almost 1,000 species of native or taxa of native plants that I had in this yard. And so have experience with growing many varieties of plants. So here's where I moved to in Minnesota. This new house, which has a 2.5 or 2.4 acre lot, and the front faces directly southwest on this hill, and they had it 100% turf. The backyard is kind of the crest of the hill, and then going down on an eastern slope to a creek, and that is all wooded. But you can see the first thing I did was try to create, and this is in a traditional landscape, was to reduce lawn, to try to create some beds that, this one has a pattern to it that I thought my neighbors would accept, with nice edges and plants being in kind of a formal type bed, formal shaped bed. Actually took a took a radius from right off the front step to make these curves. But the first thing again I did was try to reduce that lawn aspect. And here was a picture from early August. We actually had some rain. Right now we are on the verge of extreme drought here in the Twin Cities region, which is the second year in a row of that. I know you've had a pretty tough summer down in Kansas City as well. And of course, that's one of the other reasons these plants, of course, are extremely resilient, as they have weathered this kind of stuff from time immemorable in the Midwest. Though, of course, our extremes are getting more extreme, and we all have some concerns with how that's going to impact this. My only comment on this in reducing lawn is, keeping a clean edge. And I'll admit, because of the drought, I haven't done a really good job. I've been letting some things seed in on the edge, and I have some concrete pavers and want to really kind of a walk here to define the edge between the lawn in front of it and this border. And I've kind of let that go a little bit. And mostly it's because of the drought. To transplant some of these things out of there, bees sowed themselves in there. In this kind of conditions is not something I want to do. But a sharp edge is always a good idea, especially when putting in this kind of landscape in a traditional landscape. And of course, for lawns themselves, why do they have to be these horrible monocultures of whatever kind of grass for your region? Think about bee lawns. This is the Tashin Bee and Pollination Center here at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, where we do demonstrate, having other plants in the lawn. And of course, these are not necessarily native. A lot of different clovers work really well and are still good for a lot of our native insects as well. And of course, we're working on research to find more native species that will, work in a lawn. Prunella vulgaris, the self-heal, and of course we have variety lanceolata is the native form of that, is turning out to be a really good Midwestern native plant to include in these. And actually in Minnesota, you can find it now in bee lawn mixes, which is real exciting. So I don't know how, I wish we could have this interaction, hear what your reactions are to seeing a lawn like this, but I love it that we can show our, we have over 500,000 visitors a year here at the Arboretum, that they get a chance to see what a bee lawn might look like at this facility. So, and of course, assessing your landscape for invasive plants. As we know, it's just a plague across most of the Midwest. And I used Cal Repair and Amur honeysuckle in this slide, even though these pictures are from my home here in Minnesota, because those are two of probably the most invasive woody species in the Kansas City area. And, my new property, my backyard woods was absolutely choked with common buckthorn, whereas probably most of you in greater Kansas City, if you have a woodland area, it's probably choked with Amur honeysuckle. And in my front yard, downslope, I had this lovely Norway maple, which is a non-native maple, a milky sapped maple, absolutely worthless to nature. None of our native moths, which normally feed on the native maples, will not feed on a Norway maple. And it was just like having a plastic tree in the front yard. And you can see on the right, the first thing I did my first summer in at this new property was to start to remove all the buckthorn. And of course, it was a major job. I don't know if I could do it again, to be honest with you, but I did it all by hand with hand tools and cut them down. And of course, people are like, well, can't you take them to the, local recycling, center where they recycle wood from people's property? And I'm like, oh my God, you have no idea what the biomass of all this is from my backyard wood. So I did have to hire a company to come in, and they did chip up all that material. But it's almost frightening thinking back to what that did look like. And of course, we'll see some pictures on how that went from both the front yard and the backyard have evolved. Also, just looking at all the other existing features, that I had, and of course I'm extrapolating this hopefully to you, thinking about your own landscape. But my backyard luckily did have a no-mow or a low-mow lawn mix in it. I literally can get by with mowing once a whole season in my backyard with that type of fescue that is. And then, of course, the woodland, these are actually pictures after the buckthorn, but there was a lot of native woodland wildflowers underneath the buckthorn still. So the trillium in the lower left there, the bellwort in the middle there. We have Virginia waterleaf in the lower right, and I have, just extensive carpets of white trout lilies that you see in the upper right there. And of course, that's what this is all about, encouraging those plants to thrive. And it is amazing how they've responded with the removal of the buckthorn. This is kind of the same view as that picture before. So without the buckthorn, and I did not use chemicals on it. I tried a little bit at the beginning, and I'm like, there's just too many other plants I want to save. And just did the physical labor of routinely every month or so during the growing season, just go out there and break off all the sucker sprouts off those plants. Of course, smaller buckthorns cut below the surface, and that'll work for Amur honeysuckle as well. Eventually, these things do die, but of course, you could treat with chemicals on the stems. Or one of the things they also do in here in Minnesota is they have these black plastic bags that you can put over the stump to kill the sprouts coming up. But do we need more plastic? Come on. So anyway, I just, made it that routine thing. And of course, plants can't survive if they don't have any leaves to provide nourishment for their roots. But so this is looking off my backyard point. And the front yard, Norway maple no more. When I had them come chip up all the buckthorn in the backyard, I had them cut down the Norway maple in the front yard and chip that up and haul it away. And of course, the whole idea was to bring back, you take out a tree. Of course, I want to replant a tree. And I didn't just replant a tree, I replanted a grove. And it's a grove of mixed birch trees. Of both the native paper birch, which we have up here in Minnesota, you don't have in Kansas City, the river birch, which of course is native across the Midwest, and I even added yellow birch, which is another more northern and eastern species, inspired by this book on winter gardens. And of course, we have a lot of winter up here in Minnesota, and looking out at a birch grove through all the seasons. But also, birches are one of the highest trees for the web of life. If you look at Ptolemy's list, they have hundreds of foliage, and they also have small seeds that many species of songbirds and small mammals eat. And I can just see the difference already. Again, that has brought me great joy that we, from the plastic tree in the front yard, I'd see things flying to the Norway maple, and they're like, well, there's nothing here, it's cover, but there's no food, there's nothing for them. And now in my front yard, I've had indigo buntings and rose-breasted growth, or at least like that, are right in my front yard. And just getting rid of that Norway maple and planting the prairie. It's kind of in what we call the June blah time here, but it's still pretty nice for some color. All right. So yeah, that's the next thing. After reduce your lawn, take out the invasive plants, and plant a shade tree or a grove of shade trees. And as I mentioned, my house faces straight southwest. What does that mean? In the summer, even in Minnesota, we get really hot and humid. I've got the sun just beating down on my house. As you can see, I planted a white oak tree to one day shade that side of my house, which of course is a sustainability issue besides planting an oak tree, one of the premier plants for wildlife. But shading my house is going to reduce my cooling bill in the summer and help make a healthier environment, a more sustainable home for me. So and then actually I also planted a quicker growing honey locust off to the side of that, by the way. You don't see in this picture that because the white oak will probably take a little more time, though they actually do grow faster than you think if you take care of them. And or besides just planting a shade tree, planting a grove of, and you already saw that from the prior slide on my birch grove. And That picture on the right is actually a birch grove at Ryman Gardens in Ames, Iowa. But what a great little, respite of nature that creates. And then they use native sedges as a ground cover underneath it. But yes, planting a shade tree, especially where it will shade your home so that you reduce the heat gain. And it's the southwest side of your house that has the highest heat gain with the summer sun, where you can make the most impact. And of course, planting a native tree with a high nature value, I think oaks are number one, and cherries are right up there, maples, hickories, birch, etc. Is going to be a really good choice where you will bring nature home. And I like to just show this, someday maybe my oak tree will look like this oak tree. This is actually a home in South Minneapolis, where this huge is the southern side of that house. And I think, oh my gosh, if that bur oak tree isn't there, how much hotter that house would be in the summertime. And of course, this is a wintertime picture, and planting a shade tree that's deciduous and loses its leaves, then you get that passive solar sun. As you can see on that, the shadows on the house are not that big. It really has a lot of sun going through it in the wintertime, also warming up that house. So it's a win-win situation to do something like this. And of course, the fact that oak, which is a keystone species, really a critical, nature for nature species of plant. I think everyone knows what a keystone, the stone at the arch that holds it all together. Oaks are really keystone species in the Midwest, and really, are critical to a healthy landscape. And of course, evergreen trees, and Kansas City and even Minneapolis. We don't have a lot of evergreen natives. You go north and east of Minneapolis, and of course we have lots of evergreen species. And for Kansas City, it's more down in the Ozarks, where you pick up the shortleaf pine. But we do have eastern red cedar, and I know there's some controversy in that. But for sustainability and nature, I'm always going to stand by, you can plant eastern red cedar. And I know that, of course, the female trees have a berry-like cone that birds can spread, and it can come up in prairies and things like that. But oh my gosh, it's the easiest aggressive plant to get rid of. You burn it or you cut it and you're done. It doesn't, sprout back from the roots. And of course, it's completely fire intolerant. So, when I think of some other plants that are way more problematic in prairie management, I'm still going to promote red cedars in most of the Midwest. And the picture on the right, I purposely do that. People are like, well, I don't like that is a male red cedar tree, and it's the little pollen cones in the spring on it can be very, very orange and make these look really kind of rusty through the winter. But I love that. It's part of the aesthetic of the Midwest. It ties in well with our winter landscapes and the color of the prairie grasses and so on. Well, that picture there has eastern white pines in the background. Picture on the left is actually a red cedar growing native on a rocky cliff. And I know even in Kansas City, red cedars are actually rare at settlement. And even here in the Twin Cities, they were, like on Minnehaha or St. Anthony Falls and some of these rocky slopes along the Mississippi River and stuff did have native red cedars. But the reason they're so valuable, of course, they're evergreen, and in the wintertime, planting these as a windbreak is really critical for blocking that wind on your home and reducing your energy needs to heat your home in the winter. I mean, it is a substantial savings by having these in your landscape. So evergreens are still important. And I look back at my house, and you can see the evergreens. They're actually on my neighbor's property there, and they're not, locally native. They're Colorado blue spruces, which are currently having some issues. And I guess you can't see, but I've actually planted some white pines here, which are more locally native. We don't have them right native in this one county I'm in, but eventually the white pines, which are really high nature value, will grow up. And again, this is, the north winds come ripping across here. My neighbors are helping me with their spruce trees. Which are getting a canker, as I think most of you, even in Kansas City, blue spruces can get that. But adding my white pines one day will fill this void and not only screen but block that northwest wind to again make my house more sustainable. And also, all the native pines are really one of the top trees for wildlife and nature. All right. And I'm going to go down the planting pyramid now. We talked about shade trees and how important they are, and evergreen trees next, but small understory trees and small trees in a prairie setting are really important. And here's redbud as one of the most classic Midwestern um, small understory trees. I think plums and chokecherry and some of those are actually the highest rated. I actually think some of the research is a little lack on giving redbud. It should actually have a higher score than it does, and that's because almost all the research is done where redbuds aren't native. In the Midwest, I can talk to you about some of my friends and all the different Lepidoptera caterpillars they're pulling off of redbuds that don't seem to get on the list. And of course, when they bloom in the spring, the number of pollinators on redbuds is really astounding, from butterflies to various bees. So they are really a very high value plant, but are part of filling that. To get that joyous landscape, you want to fill all those layers. So, on the picture on the left there's a redbud under some evergreen trees, and on the right it's actually more on the edge of a deciduous woodland, though you can see a white pine in the front part there. But it's just adding that extra layer. And of course, every layer that you add creates another niche for more nature, and again, bringing that all together. I also like them because they just are a comfortable scale to us. It's called human scale. See the little girl walking on the path there. If you take out that redbud, just think how that space would look or feel without it. It would be much bigger and not feel as comfortable. Just like you're in a room in your home. It's just more of a personal space that these kinds of trees create. And of course, we could talk about all the other choices you could have. In Missouri, flowering dogwood is also one of my favorites for things like this. And up here, pagoda dogwood, and of course we can use redbud. These pictures are from Minnesota. The picture on the right is some of the oldest redbuds at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. And I think you can see my cursor. I mean, look at these. What a living sculpture they create. So here's also my backyard. And after I took out the buckthorns, of course, I didn't have so much of that understory or that next layer. Here's a redbud tree that I planted. You can see on the left part with the pink flowers. This was in spring. There actually were a few little native eastern wahoos, Euonymus atropurpureus, and that were sneaking in, just as little suckers under the buckthorn, just barely surviving. And of course, now those are 15 feet tall, now 5 years later, and filling that mid-layer niche. And even up here, you can see up by my house, this is a pagoda dogwood. I didn't plant it, the birds planted it up there. And of course, I recognized the seedling and have let it just grow up, again, to create that layer between, the canopy trees here and the ground layer. So don't forget about adding that understory tree layer. And of course, plant a hedgerow or a mass of native shrubs. Picture on the left is actually at the Hedges collection here at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, and it's leatherwood, Dirca palustris. In Kansas City, you couldn't plant it out in full sun like you can here in the upper Midwest. Of course, it's native across the entire Midwest. But there are some differences between the upper Midwest and the lower Midwest. That would scorch in Kansas City, but it would work in a shady situation. The picture on the right is actually gray dogwood, which is more northern Missouri up into Minnesota. But you have the rough leaf dogwood, which is its southern or lower Midwest counterpart, though there's a huge section of the Midwest where both species are. But it's amazing how shrub thickets are so critical. And again, native species are so critical for songbird nesting. A lot of our non-native, or most of our non-native invasive shrubs have really, they leaf out really early in the spring, and they have really stiff stems. and birds are attracted to nesting in them because of that. The only thing is the predators know that, and the stiff branches and so on of those easily hold a raccoon or a possum to destroy those nests. And we're learning that things like birds that nest in those do not have as good success as nesting in are really more wiry, wobbly native shrubs. They can't climb up into them as well, and nesting successes are higher in the native species. And I already showed this picture, but here's the winter image of my birch grove in the front yard that I replaced that horrible Norway maple with. And not only was it a grove of birches, but planted as an understory through that space is a thicket of dogwoods. And of course, that is, it's just a thrill watching that. It is red osier dogwood, red twig dogwood, which is only an upper Midwest shrub. You do not want to use that in Kansas City. It's just too hot and dry. But the silky dogwood, very similar species, would be a good choice, or the roughleaf dogwood for you in Kansas City in the lower Midwest. But just looking at this picture, thinking about, again, I already talked about all the songbirds that have come into the front yard. All our native dogwoods have berries that are really, really fat-rich, high in lipids. And most of them ripen in late summer when migration is starting or when there's a lot of young birds. And my front yard is just, full of cedar waxwings and robins and catbirds. And of course, when those, even things like flycatchers and a lot of our migrant warblers will eat dogwood berries, even though they're mainly insectivores. The high fat content of dogwood berries, I've seen, the phoebes and peewees, and was I just watching a Philadelphia vireo, and which warbler did I just see, snarfing down these berries, a Tennessee warbler. So planting those is really going to bring those things in. And again, my list for birds in my new property has now climbed to 130 species for being in a suburban area compared to my 180 in the rural setting in Missouri. I am really, really happy about that. And certainly the plantings have made a difference. Of course, planted diversity of native perennials for beauty through each season. And it's not, of course, that joy of bringing in all the different insects. A lot of bees are just out in the spring or just out in the fall, and making sure you have things blooming from as early in the season as you can all the way till the late season. We have many specialist pollinators on the spring flowers, from spring beauty and wild geraniums have their own species of bees that will feed their young pollen from no other plants. And in the fall, asters and goldenrods are absolutely, critical. Again, like the oak tree, they are really keystone species of the Midwest. And, to really have a healthy environment, you must have them in your landscape. So spring on the left, or later spring, midsummer, and of course the fall landscape. I am struggling with getting many asters in my front yard because, we have some of our nature can be a little rough on us. Minnesota rabbits are really vicious, and they sniff out any aster I plant and love to cut them off. But it is amazing now that I'm getting a better matrix of grasses and so on in that landscape in the front. The asters are able to sneak in there and not get eaten by the rabbits because I am letting it, become a full dense matrix of plants. Talk more about that. Of course, that was for the prairie, and in the backyard woods, the same thing goes. Think of things blooming from the earliest in spring all the way till fall. And here I look at these, and it just brings me great joy thinking of what this did look like. This was the edge of the buckthorn hill with nothing, and planting things like woodland phlox and columbine and Virginia bluebells, along with just all the native things I showed you coming back. My backyard woodland is just becoming an inspiration and bringing in all kinds of beneficial insects, and thus the birds, and et cetera, et cetera. And, okay, so that's spring, here's fall. Well, this is almost making me depressed because we're in such severe drought right now. These are blue wood asters, and I did not plant them. They were a few somehow hung on underneath the buckthorns, but boy, once the buckthorns were pulled out, they came in like crazy. And oh my gosh, it's just pollination station with all kinds of bees right now. Though again, it looks like, it's about 20% of this right now. It is just so dry here. It's just shocking that they are really struggling. And I do not water beyond, immediately around my house. So they're going to have to weather this and will. But I hope you get the message that, and even in a woodland, you tend to hear comments like, well, there's nothing for, shade in the summer or fall. And that's completely not true. I have things like, poke milkweed blooming in midsummer in the backyard. And of course, the various woodland asters, this being blue wood aster. There's Drummond's aster that I have, also native. There's, white snakeroot, Edgeratina altissima, even planted from Missouri, the blue flowering mist flower, Conoclinium celestinum. And, you do have plants that even in a shady setting, you can have through the whole season. So fall aster is critical. And of course, when I talk about this, bringing in joy, you really need to connect with all your other senses as well. And, do think about things that are fragrant. Here we've got in the upper left, vernal witch hazel, blooming from the winter solstice into March. And, I think of it being the first really, floral scent that we have each season. And right below it is the opposite end of the season, the summer grape, Vitis estivalis, which that little fringy little flower may not look like anything, but boy, does it pack a punch. I would know when it was in bloom when I'd come out of my house in Missouri, right around the summer solstice, opposite of the winter solstice, when the vernal witch hazel might bloom, and smell that plant. Wild plums, the white flowers in the dead center, always connects me to my heritage. My family farms in Iowa, that was a hedgerow plant. Of course, that's all ripped out now, which is sad with the way agriculture has changed. But I think of my grandmother, and she made the most delicious wild plum apple jelly. Still hear her laugh when I smell that plant. And of course, fragrances also bring back memories more so than any of the other senses. So rose verbena at the lower picture there with its wonderful scent. And if you've never put your nose to our native sunflowers, they're blooming right now. Get out and do that, because most of them have the most delightful cocoa scented flowers. And I mean, as in COCOA, they smell like, hot chocolate. Just a great plant. And I think that is Maximilian sunflower at Paul Gardens on the right there. So these are really important plants, not only as, nectar and for pollinators, but for our own joy. And of course, a water feature, I talked about the water cycle a little bit, but just helping to bring in that component to any landscape is really helpful. And the sound of water, and, of course, all life needs water to survive. You'll have dragonflies and frogs and turtles and, on migration, the warblers. The picture on the right is in my backyard. I made that little stream garden and pond. Should do an updated picture of it because that was right after it was installed. But, especially with this extremely dry weather we're having up here right now, the migrant birds can stop in and get a drink in a safe setting and, be onward on their migration to, the South and Central America and beyond. So, and, the picture on the left is just from a Wild Ones local garden club tour. And I love that too. It's like these are just magnets for a place to sit out and, enjoy water. And, there's a whole suite of plants that like water as well. And you can see I've added some sedges in mine on the right there. They have some cattails and a water lily, though it's non-native cattails in that picture, but we won't talk about that. And of course, use vines. Talk about the chameleons of the landscape world. On the left, I call that that was actually at my picture or from my Missouri home, the botanical death match. But on a big old tree that, that's not going to impact it. And there you've got a mix of Virginia creeper and Canada moonseed, and it seemed like there is a wild grape in there as well. And when you look at those are all really high value plants. The Virginia creeper has really, just like the dogwood, fat rich berries in the fall that fuel migrating birds. Virginia creeper, I bet none of you can tell me what the flowers look like on it, but I had that growing on my house in Missouri. And when it was in bloom, I'd step out the door and you'd hear all this. It's like pollinators galore on those little tiny flowers. They are very nectar rich, and it is amazing how important they are. Same with grapes. Many species of birds eat that. Both grapes and Virginia creeper are related, and the number of moth species whose caterpillars feed on those is just astounding. A lot of them are those sphinx moths, the ones that look like hummingbirds. I think there's one called the Virginia creeper sphinx, or sometimes called the hog sphinx. I remember sitting on my back patio in Missouri with a glass of wine, and hog sphinx flew up and pulled down its proboscis and had a little drink. They actually can imbibe rotting fruit and so on, but I've shared a glass of wine with a sphinx moth. Not many people can say that, I bet. But we are going to see more vines as living curtains for, again, sustainable living. And think about these native species. The worst caveat right now is these are really great plants, but the damn Japanese beetles love these plants too, and so that is turning off people because of the aesthetic damage that Japanese beetles can do to these. And I hope we can get past that, because don't not plant one because Japanese beetles are going to eat it is so critical for the rest of nature. Please still do. But when you think about this wall on the right is actually an urban landscape inside Minneapolis. And I think on a summer day, walking past that cloaked in green of those Virginia creepers versus if that was just a hot south-facing wall, just think how much this helps reduce the heat island effect and all those issues of trying to keep ourselves cool in the summertime. So I had to throw in this picture. I recently walked by it in a home in Minneapolis, and I thought, in the future, we're going to be doing more of this. And one of the things is as energy costs rise, having a house cloaked in green on the south side is going to reduce your summer cooling bill. And I know in Japan, they actually are doing this. After Fukushima, they were forced to. A lot of places, they just had to cut back on energy use in the summer, and you're just going to see more and more of this. I'm shocked it's still not taking on with higher energy prices. You're going to just see more of this, and I hope all of you who are designers out there are thinking ahead on how this is going to be incorporated in more landscapes. Of course, give up the mulch. I was starting to allude to that, talking about my front garden becoming a matrix planting where things grow together so tightly that you don't need mulch. I mean, I might start out with mulch to help deter weeds with a new planting. Or you can do a matrix planting where you plant a lot of mostly sedges here. It's sedges on the left, Pennsylvania sedge, on the right for shade, wild ginger and maidenhair fern. But in a matrix planting, you would plant these pretty tight so they would fill in quite quickly. That can be kind of expensive depending on where you're at. And, for me, it was, I did let, these things self-sow into all those places. And it was just more economical for me to do it that way. Though you had to be a little more vigilant on the weeds. But come on, do we want to display a bunch of ground up wood versus having all these live things there, again, creating that basis for the web of life. Also, again, talking about, heat island effect and cooling effect, and, they're all doing their photosynthesis, creating air for us to breathe rather than that stupid mulch. And of course, capturing runoff. I mean, it goes on and on and on why you need to dump the mulch and start using plants. And of course, we all know British gardeners always laugh at Americans and how we love to display our mulch. So, and as you know, there are just ground covers galore. I have a whole section in my native plants of the Midwest on that. Upper left, is actually from my Missouri garden, where it's mostly cream violets and woolly blue violets growing together. There is a wonderful matrix zigzag goldenrod, one of the goldenrods for shade. I have both elm-leaved and zigzag goldenrod, which also does well. Both do well in Kansas City. So again, I talked about keystone species for pollinators. So Eastern Star Sedge, it's Carex radiata. And of course, river oats, perennial gardeners complain, river oats seeds all over the place. Well, use it to that advantage. Create a nice solid bed of it. It really is great for nature to just let that be. There's lots of our native butterflies, caterpillars feed on that. The littlewood satyr and the northern pearly eye are two I think of right away, probably gemmed satyr. And of course the seeds, many, well, they're edible to us, but many birds will eat the seeds on those as well. So that mass planting is at the entrance to Paul Gardens, by the way. And again, matrix planting, I forgot I put this slide in there, but my front yard has in effect become a matrix. And it's been really interesting. I'm actually glad I held back, because no matter how good we think we are, I've been gardening for over 50 years, and you think something's going to do well on a site, and you learn that for whatever reason, it isn't going to be happy there. But prairie drop seed, which are these kind of tufty grasses in here, are doing really well in my front yard. And for the first time, I have never seen this in any other garden I've ever grown. They are self-sowing. And then I planted blue grama and side oats grama, and I thought the blue grama is going to be so happy. It's a southwest hot slope. That's what they like. They all died, but the side oats grama is just self-seeded in as thick as can be, and I couldn't be happier. And that's where some of these rabbit plants are sneaking in, and the rabbits aren't finding them. But in this picture, again, you're seeing different layers. Here's a dwarf indigo, which is native in northern Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, not quite into Missouri. Well, it might have been. It's just that we ruined all the prairies in the northwest corner of Missouri. Pale purple coneflower here, the seed heads. I see rattlesnake master, foxglove penstemon. It really is a matrix. And I just think about how this is capturing all the runoff. All this is for nature. Loving it in my front yard. And don't forget to provide some bare earth. What is it? It's like 40% of our native pollinators actually nest in the ground. So, and how I do this is, have some self-sowing annuals like daisy fleabane, which usually just comes up no matter where you garden. The seed bank is there. Let some of that be, and as it fades in the fall, you can trim it out, because the stalks of it can look a little goofy. But and then of course black-eyed Susan's on the right, and I hope you saw my recent article in the New York Times. So talking about native annuals through Margaret Roach on A Way to Garden. So do think about having some of those barriers. I was making fun of mulch, but mulch is not a bare area. Having some bare earth, or even sparser turf, those bee lawns. I have a lot of leaf cutter bees in my front lawn. It's just not a dense turf, and they're going down underneath and nesting in the ground in that more open turf. So critical for that kind of thing. So I'm just amazed at my yard, though Minnesota just does not have, especially this area near the Corn Belt, we do not have as many butterflies as Kansas City does. But I have had up to 40 monarchs in my front home from work. It's amazing. Things like swamp milkweed and the blue verbena there came back without me even planting them in my yard. Of course, cardinal flower, I actually did plant that. But if you bring these things, again, as Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, if you plant it, they will absolutely come back. And so there is my statement. Yeah, if you plant it, they will come. And that is my butterfly feeder in my front yard in Missouri. I put all kinds of scraps of fruit. It's just it's just a hanging bird bath that I hung on a nylon cord. You can't put it on the chain because the raccoons and possums can figure that out, but it's really wobbly that they can't get on. Look at that. I think to that. Oh my gosh, I don't know if I've ever seen that many butterflies here moving to Minnesota, but I could have 600 butterflies at one time in my front yard in Missouri. Again, having all those wonderful host plants and all those nectar sources through the seasons. These are the things that you have. You know, you can see the traditional landscape and well in it. The native. You can hear the twittering thing. That is the end of my. I should just leave that up, Amy or Stacia. So I know we can go to comments afterward.
That sounds perfect. Thank you very much, Alan, for joining us, and thank you for the inspiration. It's interesting, isn't it? For the most part, we're probably all inside looking at a computer screen, and yet your pictures were evocative of where we want to be instead. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. Please take a moment to fill out the session evaluation and let us know what you think. If you have questions for Alan, please join us in our office half hours, which are immediately following this session. Go back to the agenda on Socio and click on that Zoom link, and there are a lot of terrific questions in the chat. So please hang on to those questions and jump on the Zoom link for the next conversation, and you can continue learning from Alan. Thank you so much, Alan, and we will see you in just a few minutes.